Today we're going to focus on the evolution of American democracy from the beginning of the unit to where we are right now. It is no surprise that the colonists that came to the Americas in the 1600s and their descendants would eventually form the first constitutional republic in the modern world. England itself in the 17th century was a pioneer in republican values. Over years, the British had limited the power of their kings and increased the power of the Parliament, which represented the people. The first immigrants to the American colonies brought these democratic ideas with them. The ideas that the people should have a legislature that enacted laws, such as tax policies, and that the king should be limited in his power by a constitution and a Bill of Rights. The Mayflower Compact was signed by the Pilgrims before they even set foot on the shores of Massachusetts. It stated that the purpose of their government in America would be to have just and equal laws. This document became a landmark of American democratic government. Each colony established a different form of government. In Virginia, where towns and settlements were spread out over large distances, a representative form of government started in which constituents elected representatives to serve in a legislature. This legislature in Virginia was called the House of Burgesses. It was the first of its kind in all the colonies. In Puritan New England, where people lived in small towns close to each other, a direct form of democracy developed. Here, all eligible members of the community would gather in the church or town hall and discuss issues and laws. All of the American colonies had a clear separation of powers between the legislature, the governor, who was usually appointed by the king or proprietor, and the courts. All colonies also had a charter or constitution and a Bill of Rights. These ideas were unique to the British colonists. The French and the Spanish settlers in the New World were unfamiliar with the ideas of self-government because they lived under absolute monarchies. Despite these strong foundations in democratic government, there were a few weaknesses by today's standards. There were many voting restrictions throughout the colonies. Only adult white males who owned property could vote. In New England, only members of the Puritan Church were eligible to vote. Furthermore, the colonies lacked unity as a whole. For the most part, each colony considered itself a separate unit from the others. In 1754, just before the French and Indian War, Benjamin Franklin attempted to organize many colonies together to fight against the French and Indians in the Albany Plan. The plan failed, but at least it was a start. It wasn't until the American Revolution that the colonies started to form a sense of national identity. In the 1760s, in protest against the tax policies of Parliament, colonists organized a few intercolonial congresses, such as the Stamp Act Congress, the First Continental Congress, and the Second Continental Congress, which served as the colony's government during the Revolution till its end. Even after the Americans miraculously defeated the British, the colonial leaders were hesitant to commit to a strong national government that would have bound the colonies together. Because of that hesitation, the Second Continental Congress wrote our country's first constitution, called the Articles of Confederation, which ended up being a total disaster. The Articles of Confederation created a weak national government. There was only one branch, the legislative branch, which had extremely limited powers. It could not tax or regulate trade. It was almost impossible to pass laws because a two-thirds majority was required. The federal government was powerless over the state governments. After a series of foreign relation problems, conflicts between states, and an uprising of farmers called the Shays Rebellion, the Founding Fathers realized they needed to create a new constitution to establish a stronger central government. In 1787, 55 men from the 13 states came to Philadelphia to write a new constitution, but it wasn't easy for them to all agree on a new system. The small states wanted a single-house legislature based on equal representation per state. The large states, on the other hand, wanted proportional representation, where more populous states would have more representatives. In order to resolve this dilemma, the delegates agreed to combine those ideas and make a bicameral legislature. The upper house would be called the Senate and would have 2 representatives per state, elected by state legislatures. The lower house would be called the House of Representatives. It would be elected directly by the people and would be based on population. Once they agreed on this issue, they dealt with the executive branch. The president would not be elected by the people because the founding fathers had a distrust of direct democracy. Instead, the president would be elected through the Electoral College. The third branch, or the judiciary, would be made up of a system of circuit courts and federal courts, with the Supreme Court at the top. Each branch would have checks and balances over the other, as you can see in this very detailed chart. The lawmaking process, appointment process, impeachment process, and much more were carefully designed to involve multiple branches, so no one branch would have more power than the other. The delegates knew that the changes they had made would make many people angry, especially those who were against surrendering states' rights to a strong central government. So the delegates came up with a way to ratify the Constitution without getting the state legislature's approval. They set up a separate convention and required only 9 of the 13 states to approve it. A huge debate began between those who supported the Constitution, who called themselves Federalists, and those who were against ratification, called the Anti-Federalists. Prominent leaders such as Alexander Hamilton and James Madison wrote essays in support of the new Constitution called the Federalist Papers. After the Federalists agreed to add a Bill of Rights, they were able to secure the votes required to ratify the new Constitution. The Bill of Rights were added by the first Congress in 1791. The First Amendment protected freedom of speech and religion. The Second Amendment protected the right to bear arms. The Third Amendment guaranteed freedom from housing troops. The Fourth Amendment promised freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures without a warrant. The Fifth, Sixth, and Seventh Amendments protected legal rights to a jury trial, a lawyer, and many others. The Eighth Amendment barred unusual punishments and excessive fines. The Ninth and Tenth Amendments are more vague. The Ninth Amendment stated that the people had rights not listed in the Constitution. And the Tenth Amendment delegated powers to the states that weren't forbidden to them in the Constitution. This amendment still is used today to defend states' rights. In 1791, it was time to actually start the new republic. Washington was unanimously elected president. In this role, President Washington set many precedents for the executive branch. He served only 2 terms, even though the Constitution did not limit him at all. President Washington also nominated the first cabinet. He also expanded federal power by using the army to crush an uprising of farmers in upstate Pennsylvania, known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Another important political development during Washington's term was the emergence of the 2-party system. Despite Washington's warnings against partisan politics, it was impossible to avoid the conflict between Hamilton and his party, called the Federalists, and Jefferson and his party, called the Democratic Republicans, over this question: what would the role of the federal government be in the economy? The Democratic Republicans believed in limited federal power and a strict interpretation of the Constitution. The Federalists wanted a strong federal government and interpreted the Constitution loosely. Because Washington was a Federalist, many of Hamilton's political and economic policies were enacted in the first 8 years of the United States. The next president was also a Federalist and a famous founding father, John Adams. Adams was not suited to the presidency, however. His most infamous action was to sign the Alien and Sedition Acts, which violated the First Amendment by limiting people's rights to criticize their government. It was at this time that angry Democratic Republicans secretly penned a manifesto in opposition to the Alien and Sedition Acts, called the Virginia and Kentucky Resolves. This document put forth the theory of nullification. Nullification was the theory that states could declare federal acts null and void if they were unconstitutional. Even though this document had no effect, it was significant in the growing perception of states and states' rights believers of the misuse of federal power. Thomas Jefferson, who was one of the authors of the Virginia and Kentucky Resolves, was elected in the Revolution of 1800. This marked the first time power peacefully transferred from one party, the Federalists, to another, the Democratic Republicans. Jefferson believed in limited federal power and immediately reversed many Federalist policies, such as the Alien and Sedition Acts. However, Jefferson was stuck when contemplating what to do with the offer by the French to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States. His philosophy was based on a strict interpretation of the Constitution, which would forbid him to purchase the territory. But as president, he felt he had to adopt a loose interpretation to take advantage of the opportunity. The purchase of the Louisiana Territory represented a huge increase in the power of the federal government. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court was quietly making decisions that also increased the power of the federal government. Led by Chief Justice John Marshall, the court, in case after case, clearly defined the supremacy of the federal government over the states. In Marbury v. Madison, the Supreme Court first established its power of judicial review, or the ability to declare acts of Congress unconstitutional. In McCulloch v. Maryland, the Supreme Court upheld the legality of a Bank of the United States and forbade states from interfering with it. In Gibbons v. Ogden, the Supreme Court reaffirmed the power of only the federal government to regulate interstate commerce, including transportation. By the 1820s, America's federal republic was strong, stable, and powerful in comparison to the states. The next major changes occurred under the presidency of Andrew Jackson, starting in 1828. Jackson's emergence on the political scene revealed a new split in political parties. The Federalists had lost power after the War of 1812, and the Democratic Republicans of Jefferson's era had dominated politics. However, Jackson's election split the party into two groups: Jackson and the Democrats versus the Republicans. Jackson's effect on politics was enormous, so enormous that he is named after an entire era, the era of Jackson, which refers to the rise of the common man in politics. Because many states had gotten rid of property requirements for voting, there was universal manhood suffrage. Candidates and political parties had to appeal to more than just the educated elite to gain votes. Campaign styles changed. Candidates had to use slogans, songs, and mudslinging tactics to get elected. While this style of politics was not limited to Jackson, he epitomized the change. Jackson was also known for pioneering the spoils system. Instead of keeping bureaucrats in their positions when he was elected as president, he kicked everyone out of their jobs and put his friends and supporters in them. This turnover of the bureaucracy became typical of politics all throughout the 1800s. A major way to win support for your election was to promise a job when you got elected. Three main issues dominated Jackson's presidency. First were the Indians. Jackson abused his executive power as president in his treatment of the Native Americans of the South. He ignored a ruling by the Supreme Court in Worcester v. Georgia. This could have been an impeachable offense, but his political power was too great to topple him. The second issue was the tariff. Tariff rates had risen from 1816 onwards. By 1828, rates were at their highest yet, causing the beginning of a sectional rebellion led by South Carolina and John C. Calhoun. Calhoun proposed to nullify the tariff law. In response, Jackson issued the Force Bill in 1833, which would have used federal troops to make South Carolina implement the tariff. Force wasn't required, but this event demonstrated the growing tension between the states and the federal government. Third, there was the bank. Despite being a strong symbol of expanding executive power, in philosophy, Jackson was more in favor of states' rights, especially when it came to the Bank of the United States. Jackson succeeded in destroying the Bank of the United States and handing more economic power back to the state banks. The growing tension between the states and the federal government finally came to a head with the Civil War. By defeating the Confederacy, two lingering constitutional issues were finally resolved. Slavery was declared illegal, and federalism triumphed over states' rights. Not only did the Civil War resolve the issue of secession and nullification, the federal government also expanded greatly during the Civil War under Abraham Lincoln. During the war, Lincoln and the Republican-dominated Congress enacted many policies that increased the power of the federal government, but also deprived people of their civil liberties. Congress created an income tax for the first time and issued paper money to pay for the war. The very first draft was enacted. Lincoln used executive powers to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed slaves in the South during the war. And Lincoln also used his powers to suspend free elections in border states, suspend habeas corpus, imprison dissidents without trial, and arrest newspaper editors who were critical of the war. No one was ever held responsible for these crimes against the Constitution. After the Civil War, the federal government kept on using its new powers. Congress sent federal troops into the South during Reconstruction to enforce the new 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. However, by 1877, the federal government withdrew the troops as well as their support for the rights of black people. The Supreme Court also interpreted the new amendments, which were meant to protect people from abuse by state governments, in a way that made them toothless. In fact, more cases were heard regarding the 14th Amendment defending the rights of corporations than the rights of black people. In the late 1800s, after the Civil War, politics were intertwined with business and corruption, thus deserving the title of the Gilded Age. Both political parties were in bed with business, both the Republicans and Democrats, though the Republicans were more associated with Eastern industrialists and bankers. Almost every policy enacted at the federal level benefited industry and the wealthy at the expense of everyone else. Railroads were given free land grants. Tariffs were kept high to protect industry. The gold standard was maintained just as the bankers wanted, and injunctions were used to stop union strikes. Politics were also disgustingly corrupt in the Gilded Age, even by today's standards. Graft was rampant. Scandals were constant, such as the whiskey ring scandal and the Credit Mobilier scandal. Political machines controlled city, state, and federal politics. Corrupt politicians like Boss Tweed used fraud, bribes, kickbacks, and much more to control elections and steal the people's tax money. Only one positive development helped clean up politics during this time. In 1883, the Pendleton Civil Service Act was signed into law. This signaled the end of the spoils system and the beginning of a competent and efficient public administration. Despite the powerful alliance of business and government, people did try to fight back and get political power. Farmers attempted to gain political power with the populism movement. All throughout the late 1800s, farmers had begun to win political victories at the state level with the Granger Laws. These laws allowed the state governments to regulate railroad rates. The Supreme Court had upheld the right of states to do this in the case Munn versus Illinois. However, in the Wabash cases, these rights were revoked due to the Interstate Commerce Clause. Efforts by Congress to limit the power of business, such as the Interstate Commerce Act or the Sherman Antitrust Act, were weak and ineffectual. So the farmers attempted to get a populist candidate into the White House. For a few years, it seemed as if they might be successful, but by 1896, their efforts were crushed. Ordinary people were also trying to fight for their rights in the union movement. Never organized into a single political party, the union movement remained politically fractured. Unable to gain power, working people were legally exploited. Immigrants were also legally discriminated against, especially people of Asian descent. By today's standards, life was pretty miserable for the majority of the population in the late 1800s. When the Progressive Era began, decades of industrialization had left their mark on politics, from the corruption and scandals to the overwhelming power of trusts and holding companies. In the year 1900, McKinley was president, a conservative who toed the Republican line of high tariffs, pro-business policies, a gold standard, and other laissez-faire philosophies. But when McKinley was shot, the new president, Teddy Roosevelt, would usher in an era of change that would come to personify the Progressive Era, and would leave lasting changes on American government. Teddy Roosevelt is considered the first progressive president. But the progressive movement started long before him. Beginning in the late 1800s, reformers began to put pressure on their state governments to make changes to address the problems of industrialization. The first progressive victories were at the state level. For example, child labor was banned not by the federal government, but by the state governments. Also, it was progressive state legislatures and courts that began to grant workers' rights, such as workers' compensation and 8-hour workdays. Innovative election procedures also began at the state level. Many states adopted the initiative, which is a bill originated by the people and then voted on in a referendum. States also implemented the recall, which was a vote to remove public officials. The direct primary and secret ballot were also state-level innovations. Teddy Roosevelt realized that the growing progressive movement and demand for change was too powerful to ignore. Though a Republican, Teddy Roosevelt was fiercely independent and pushed through many reforms that dramatically changed the role of the federal government. He approved laws that regulated railroad rates and protected consumers. He took vast expanses of public land and protected them from private land speculation by creating national parks. He used federal power to bust monopolistic trusts and negotiate between workers and owners during strikes. Teddy Roosevelt presided over the greatest expansion of federal power since the days of Lincoln. Roosevelt, after running for his second term, decided to follow Washington's lead and did not run for a third term, instead endorsing his friend and vice president, Taft. After one term, however, Roosevelt became disenchanted with Taft and decided to run for a third term. Denied the nomination by the Republican Party, Teddy Roosevelt ran in the election of 1912 on a third-party ticket, named the Bull Moose Party. The only thing this did, however, was split the Republican vote, in effect handing the victory to Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, like Teddy Roosevelt, is known for his progressive policies as president. Wilson approved a stricter antitrust act and continued to bust monopolistic trusts. He also continued policies to regulate businesses, protect workers, and ensure the safety of products for consumers. Wilson signed into law the Federal Reserve Act, which established the nation's first comprehensive banking system since the Bank of the United States was destroyed by President Jackson in the 1830s. Many amendments were made during Wilson's presidency as well. The 16th Amendment legalized the income tax. The 17th Amendment made it so senators were directly elected by the people instead of by the state legislatures.